Good morning, everyone. My name is Abina Jones. I'm a student at Northern Illinois University, majoring in business administration. I'll be introducing our speaker on our session, Metaphors We Pay By, How Logistics Shapes Payment, by our speaker, Wilson Harmond. Wilson Harmond is a finance professional with a unique blend of expertise spanning finance, logistics, economics, and history with a foundation in industrial engineering from the Georgia Institute of Technology. Wilson applies system thinking to unravel the intricate web of financial networks and drive meaningful results. I want to remind everyone at the end of the session to please complete the session evaluation in the mobile app. But without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Wilson Harmond.
Before I start, can everybody hear me just fine? Awesome. Love to hold the mic, but if I can use my hands, I like to talk. So my name is Wilson Harmond. I work for Flywire. I'm a payments growth manager there. I wear a lot of different hats, kind of whatever the business needs me to do, whether that's managing partnerships, managing flow of funds, or managing getting a product from idea to launch. I kind of have gotten to do it all. It's been a great experience. Like the introduction said, I have a background in industrial engineering, and I also really enjoy history. I really enjoy thinking about how things fit together and how things connect. And that kind of led me to this presentation. But before I really get into it, I want to start with my first day of payments. It was actually with Neil Hellner in Cleveland. And it was the last rotation spot that anybody wanted to get in our credit training, treasury training program. And I volunteered to go up to Cleveland for 2 weeks right before my wedding. My wife, thankfully, now wife, wasn't super thrilled, but it was a really impactful experience. And what made it so impactful was the very first day, where Neil turned to me and started asking me, hey, what do you know about payments? So I started ripping off every single term that I'd heard and read about on Investopedia or BIS or some random training slide that I'd been given, right? And then Neil's like, okay. So what's the difference between clearing and settlement? I was like, started to ramble off, some canned answer about things being connected and things being available versus being, in transit. He was like, okay. And he continues to drill these questions. And finally he looks at me, he's like, all right, I've got an assignment for you. Here's 15 terms. Go out, define them, and then come back to me. Make a presentation, present it to me, and then we can talk. So I sat down, and over 2 days, I put together all of these terms, I put together all of these definitions, and then Neil said, all right, now we can talk. Because we could finally speak the same language. What was really interesting about all of those terms, though, is a lot of them are really familiar to me. Coming from industrial engineering, I learned a lot about logistics. I learned a lot about how things move, about supply chains. And the words like rail, or network, or gateway, even interchange, clearing and settlement, all come from commerce, from physical commerce. And I kind of thought that was really interesting, didn't really think much of it, let it sit on the side for a while. Then my brother actually gives me a book called The Metaphors We Live By. And one of the ideas that the author puts forward is that the metaphors that we use are able to shape how we think about the world. The language that we use shapes how we think about the world. So take the primary examples he gives are time is money, right? Everybody's heard that one. Where you think about spending your time, that's not worth my time. There's also the argument is war. You think about, I'm trying to win this argument. I'm trying to counter their point, right? And what if argument wasn't war, right? What if argument was finding consensus? What if it was a dance? What if it was something else, right? So these conceptual metaphors really allow us to explain abstract thoughts and abstract concepts with really concrete ideas, right? Really physical things. And that's what we do in payments, because payments is really all messages, right? With the exception of moving a physical bar of gold or a dollar, everything is a message at this point, and it's all traveling electronically. And what I'm kind of proposing is that understanding these metaphors that we pay by, understanding these terms, and understanding the logistics industry and the history behind it can help us, innovate in the future, as well as avoid some of the pitfalls that have impacted that industry when it came to regulation or innovation. So, I really want to drive this home. The payments and logistics are related because they both accomplish two things, the same two end goals, right? They are trying to move something from A to B, whether it is a shipping container from Shanghai to Chicago, or a payment from Chicago to Shanghai for that shipping container. And they also facilitate commerce, right? They're doing the same end goal at the same time. And they've evolved in step over time as well. It's only recently that they've kind of become detached, but I think we're now entering an era where we'll be able to really kind of bring them back together. This very digital era. And to, drive it home a little further, right? Charlie Munger, great investor, I don't need to say much about him, but he had this idea about mental models, right? And mental models are pretty much the same in the conceptual metaphor framework, right? It's just a way to think about a problem in terms of something else. Some of the, the more famous one is invert, always invert. And, it really pushes some of the boundaries of what you can understand if you're willing to go outside of your comfort zone, if you're willing to go outside of your industry to look for ideas and look for inspiration. In logistics, there are kind of three main models. I'm going to focus a lot on that last one, but I want to just briefly run through them. Right, the first one on the natural monopolies. As you build out a rail network, as you build out ports, they're very expensive, they're very capital intensive, and to try and build competing lines right next to each other drives everybody to zero. So eventually, the economies of scale went out. Typically, a first mover wins. That's why we still have Visa and MasterCard dominating the card market, but we haven't seen any, any major challenges to that two-player dominance. Similar thing plays out in railroads. There are only 4 major railroads in the United States, right? And that's because putting 2 rail lines side by side makes no sense. It's not profitable for either. You're moving half the volume with the same amount of fixed cost. Network effects is all, there's been a lot written and a lot talked about network effects. You can go read 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel. You can go read about Metcalfe's law and the value of networks. As you add more nodes, as you add more connections, the network becomes more valuable. As it becomes more valuable, people want to naturally use it more. But the last one is the one that I really want to focus on, and this idea of intermodal transportation. So one of the biggest revolutions in all of kind of maritime and global trade was the introduction of the standardized shipping container. The CEO of Flexport cites it as one of the greatest innovations of the last 50 years. You can actually go read Patrick Collison, the CEO of Stripe, cites the shipping container as a major inspiration and source of what they're trying to build for payments. You can even look towards Dee Hock, the CEO, founder of Visa, also made the comparison back in the 70s and 80s, right? This idea has been around for a really long time, and it's only really now that we have some technology and the capabilities to really potentially make payments intermodal. When it came to shipping, the goods were really loose prior to the shipping container, right? They had to be the size that a single person or team of people could operate. They could only be so large, and during shipping and during the whole transportation process, 41% of the cost was associated with the manual labor of loading and unloading the materials. That doesn't even take into account the idle time that the ship or the train is sitting at port and not able to do additional things, right? That is a fixed investment that is not being utilized, right? Once the shipping container came out in the 1960s and really took steam in the 1970s, it was a massive shift in how goods could be moved, but it also required a lot of capital outlay, right? And the gears might be turning for where I'm going next, but it required a lot of capital outlay, right? You had to invest in new trucks, you had to invest in new ships, in new cranes, in new equipment to get things on and off, in equipment to load the shipping containers and then unload them, right? You had to change your docks. Everything had to be updated in order to realize all of the efficiencies. And I think that we're in a similar era in payments with the introduction of AI, but also ISO 20022, a standardized payments message for all payment types. It has 1,500, more than 1,500, well-defined, easily parsed fields. And when you compare that to a typical MT103 file, I do a lot of international payments, so I apologize to domestic-only people. But if you do like an MT103 file, there's only one line where you can start to include lots of invoice information, right? And you only have, I think, about 160 characters. Versus, and you can't structure it very well, and it may or may not make it to its end destination depending on how it's processed. Versus the standardized message in the XML format for ISO 20022 allows you to move all of that information, all this data-rich information from one place to another, which is amazing. But there's also a catch, is that just because you move this data-rich information from one place to another, just because you've generated it, doesn't mean you can use it on the other end, right? All the ERP systems, all these legacy banking systems, right? There's still some that run on COBOL or run on mainframe that's written in BASIC that I'm pretty sure my grandmother who worked in banking and my mother who worked in banking and myself all wrote BASIC to interact with these tables. And it's going to be a bit of an upset, right? It's going to require some learning pain. It's going to require some growth. There were similar things in the logistics industry when it came to the dock workers, right? They were really pushing back against this growth in payments, right? We might see things like card networks potentially pushing back on faster payments or on real-time payments. You might see a lot of people, a lot of the ERP systems not wanting to make all the investments because it is expensive and it does take disruption. But, I've talked about Patrick Collison. It's one of the things that, while it seems so mundane, this one change in the payment message, it has that one mundane, boring thing is what actually drives the innovation. It's what has second and third order effects that cause the world to become more connected, cause commerce to move faster, and ultimately give us a more globalized economy, right? I know recent trends have moved a little bit towards regionalization, but even then you still have cross-border, you still have new payment rails being developed. You've got RTP, FedNow, here in the US. In India, you've got UPI, you've got Pix in Brazil, which are two of the biggest use cases for ISO 20022 in real-time payments now. Santander just last week announced that they were able to complete a real-time gross settlement cross-border payment. So it's really starting to pick up, and it's because we've standardized how we talk to one another across these different networks. So, to extend some of those metaphors that I talked about earlier, right? We have the rails, we have the networks and the terminals. I want to propose three sort of extensions of this. So the first is just-in-time payments. Then we have load balancing, which I know can be a bit of a dirty word in merchant processing today, but I promise I chose it for a reason. And then intermodal payments, right? And they kind of go from most accessible with our current technology without making a whole lot of investment to, potentially AC change, as the head of CHIPS put when they changed over to ISO 20022 about a month ago. So the first is just in time. So in manufacturing logistics, you probably, if you've done any business classes, you've read about the Toyota way, lean manufacturing, just-in-time inventory, just-in-time delivery. The real innovation there was shrinking the working capital, right? Which is an easy one to bring over immediately to treasury services, right? It is saying, okay, I need to send this payment right when it's due, right? Rather than, I've got to account for this big window of time, settlement, weekends, any number of things that could cause international payments even gets more complicated when you take into account holidays or the extra regulatory requirements on either end, right? It focused on that demand pull, So when the money was when the goods are needed, when the parts needed to be produced or the widgets needed to be delivered, that is when they were delivered, not before. They didn't sit idle. You didn't have a lot of float in inventory. Same in payments, right? There are opportunities to decrease that float, to increase the working capital, increase the cash conversion cycle, and overall drive better experiences for payment practitioners, for customers, clients, payers, beneficiaries, and payment processors. Next, we have load balance payments, and I know in some merchant processing, the idea of load balancing is spreading it out so you can avoid getting on the match list and being able to have your chargebacks go above certain levels. But in logistics, load balancing is about moving things across the network in the most optimal way, right? And that's optimizing for cost, that's optimizing for urgency, that's optimizing for availability. It also extends to telecom, which is a natural analog to payments, messaging, electronic payments messaging. And there are different algorithms you can use to score which method you should use, which route you should take. And in payments, you can use similar ideas to score somebody coming up to you and saying, hey, I am a customer and I want to, I have a bill that's due 30 days from now. Figure out how to pay it. Well, you might say, okay, you've got the funds available. We can move it really cheap, right? But it might take a little bit longer. But if you're trying to cost optimize, great. Here's your lowest cost routing. Or they say, hey, this is really high urgency. I need this there in 15 minutes. You might find a different route, right? You might also balance across, if you're managing a payments network like Flywire does, right? You might balance how your funds flow across that network so that there's no one point of risk or failure as the funds are flowing. And finally, the little further out there one is intermodal payments. So in logistics, right, you see shipping containers that are loaded onto a boat, and then they're loaded onto a train, and then onto a truck, and they never have to be unpacked, right? And that cuts down on processing time, that cuts down on the risk of theft or loss or damage. It also allows you to track it all the way through, so you're able to know where it is at any given point in time. Companies like Flexport do this. Freight forwarders, they're really leaning into the data richness, and obviously the electronic bill of lading really kind of accelerated that to be able to track things through the entire logistics system. In payments, this is one area I'm excited about and happy to talk a lot more about than just this conversation, is what if a payment can start life as an ACH transfer in the US and end as a UPI payment in India without ever being unpacked. And by unpacked, I mean settled, right? It's not coming in as an ACH, getting settled at a US bank, then taking a SWIFT wire across, getting settled across at a correspondent bank, and then getting sent out, right? It goes end to end without being touched. This is kind of the dream of crypto and distributed ledger blockchain technologies. They have some of that availability, but there's also hesitancy on adopting them, especially from a central bank perspective. You want to be able to have monetary and capital controls. So this is kind of that balance of how can banks work together with the government, with technologists, with people who are building these wonderful AI models that we've been hearing about nonstop in every other session to build a better world that moves faster. What are the first, second, third order effects of that, right? And all these innovations that I've talked about, right? Whether it's AI or ISO 20022, these new payment rails, right? They're all innovations. But to get the maximum benefit out of it, to actually get the impact in the world, we have to figure out how to apply it. We have to figure out how to take those innovations and find practical uses for them. So I'll leave it at that and open it up to any questions anybody has. And thank you so much for coming.
Do you think think that the ISO 20022 format is the engine for some of these ideas that you presented there?
I believe the standardization will be the ultimate driver, because just like not being able to speak a foreign language, you know, it's the example I gave the other day, right? If you're able to send a message, a rich, detailed message in French, that's great if you can read French. But if you only speak English, it's useless to you, right? You might only be able to pick out bits and pieces. And today we've kind of been doing that with a lot of our legacy networks. You know, we're seeing some standardization, some data richness, but you've got to get everybody on board speaking the same language. Once everybody's speaking the same language, using the same terms, using the same structure, that's when you get to see this advancement. That's when you get to see all of these second and third order effects. Not just, oh, it's faster, you have more data, AI can read it, but you can do, you know, more advanced forecasting. You can do intermodal payments. You can do smarter payment routing. You can start even doing, I think about from Flywire's perspective on netting, right? Netting transactions within your network so you don't have to actually transfer them. And you could do that when you have that level of data, that level of richness, and it opens up a whole new world of opportunities.
Is that something that is actively being worked on kind of on the back end? Like your concept right now it's kind of wild to think about. I love the idea of it, but I'm just wondering, is it something that's like being pushed, and is there kind of a timeline in your mind where something like this could be available?
Yeah, in terms of being worked on, there are multiple, so all of these things, if you go to the presentation link, you can actually read the notes, and the notes have links to either who's actively working on it, who has talked about it, or what needs to be done in order to get them there. The just-in-time payments, you're starting to see it a little bit more with the push for real-time payments, and you can go listen to Neil talk about the inevitability of instant payments a little bit later today, right? That is, I think that's because it's so easy. You can point at use cases like insurance disbursements. You can point at use cases like travel, being able to instantly, you know, fund a travel card to be able to go buy something. When it comes to the smart routing, it depends. If it's a proprietary network, you tend to have some of that smart routing going on, but that tends to be proprietary. It tends to be a closed loop. There are only a few companies out there that are starting to talk about more efficient routing across a broader spectrum, but there's not been a product that I've found yet that somebody's got there. That one I see as kind of a next like 3 years as we really start to see ISO tick up. It's supposed to be implemented by the end of 2025, I think, across pretty much every major payment network. I think that's when you'll start to see a lot of fintechs and, you know, SaaS companies really popping up because they can use this rich data with AI, with payments networks, and being able to plug and play with things like Stripe to really drive things forward. I would keep an eye on Stripe for, you know, especially what they're talking about, what they're thinking about, because they are approaching payments from that shipping container lens. On the intermodal side, there are, again, closed private loop, like private networks that are running intermodal payments today. There was, I'm blanking on the name right now, there's actually a company back 10 years ago that was their tagline for one of their products, was offering intermodal payments. And D-Hawk was actually on their board. So he was a big proponent, big believer in it, all the way up until he passed about 2 years ago. You know, that timeline, if you want to take the crypto optimist, right, you could see that in next year or two, depending on how it rolls out. You've got JP Morgan with payment tech developing their own internal blockchains. You've got some of that coming with like Swift GPI is a little bit faster, but that one is kind of one of those wild cards. It could be in the next 3 years, it could be 10 years, and it's because it requires so much capital investment because you can build the network all day long. It's just like Field of Dreams though, except if you build it doesn't mean they will come. You've got to get the adoption. You've got to, especially in the US, you've got a lot of incumbent interest around cards and how we use cards today versus the push for like Zelle payments or for you know, a real-time bank transfer like you have in Australia. Right, Australia only has like 13 banks and only 4 that have any significant size for consumers, so they're able to have a greater proliferation of that. In India, you've got UPI, where everything from a cup of chai all the way up to a car can be purchased just by scanning a QR code and sending money across. They kind of skipped over cards in a way that the US didn't. So we've kind of got all this infrastructure for merchant acquiring that would have to be adapted to allow for intermodal payments, and that would require kind of everybody coming together as an industry and really driving this new standard, or having someone like TCH or the Federal Reserve come in and say, hey, this is how we're going to do it. Good questions. Anything else? I'm happy to answer it. If you don't have any now, you can find me on LinkedIn. You can read the much better formatted and well thought through and structured blog post, or view the slides. Feel free to email me. It's just wilsonharmond@flywire.com. Or if you want to email my personal, it's the same thing, but at Gmail. So thank you guys so much.
Thank you.